Hello, everybody. Welcome. Today, we're going to talk about habitats, which is a really exciting topic because it's something that all creatures need to have, and we're going to talk about why. So, to start off, what is a habitat? What do I mean by that? Well, if we were going to put it in a simple as definition as we can, we'd probably just say a place where an organism lives, a place where a living creature lives. But we can expand that a little bit to mean the environment where an organism lives throughout the year or for shorter periods of time. So maybe they live there just during the summer season, or maybe they live there only for 1 week in March or something like that. So it can mean a lot of different things. But a great way to think about habitat is to think about the components or the essential things that organisms need to survive. So what do all living things need to survive? What are the 4/5 things that every creature needs? And you probably already know these, so take a second to think about that. So number one, air. All living things need air to survive and to breathe, particularly us as human beings. All living things need water to be able to drink, to stay hydrated, different things like that. All organisms need food, and my symbol for food is just this pot, because depending on what creature you are, you're going to eat different things, but everything needs to eat something. Shelter, so something to protect you from the elements, something to keep you safe and warm, or protect you from predators. Space, so this is kind of the fifth one. That's maybe something you haven't heard about before, but every living thing needs space to occupy. So when we're thinking about habitat, the main components of a habitat are shelter, water, food, and space. And a habitat is said to have a suitable arrangement when it has the correct amount of all of those things. So sometimes a habitat can meet some components of a suitable arrangement, but not all. But our ideal habitat has the perfect arrangement and perfect amount of all of those things for depending on what creature we are. So how we're going to kind of walk through this today is we're going to talk about the ideal habitats for two different creatures, the American coot and the eastern bluebird. And we're going to look at their life histories of these two species that live here in Missouri. And both of them are here in both the summer and winter time, although the American coot is only in the northern part of Missouri during the summer typically. But that's kind of that summer season is what we're going to focus on in terms of habitat. So we're going to look at the essential components for each of these species and then think about what might be a good habitat for them. So the first one we're going to talk about is the American coot. So let's talk about it. So they need water. So this is obvious for them to drink, to stay hydrated. And we'll talk a little bit about some other reasons that the coot might need water. But that's one thing that they're going to need for their habitat. They're also going to need their food. So American coots mainly eat aquatic plants, and these include things like algae, duckweed, wild rice, water lilies, cattails, different things like that. And when they're on land, they also pick at terrestrial plants and sometimes eat greens or leaves of different trees. But they're not exclusively vegetarian. You'll also see them eating some insects, such as like beetles, dragonflies, and other things. And they'll also eat different crustaceans and snails and small vertebrates, such as tadpoles and salamanders, even sometimes. But for the main part, they're mainly going to eat those aquatic plants. Shelter. So they're going to need spaces to hide and evade predators. And they're also going to need places to nest. So what type of nest does the American coot make? It makes this kind of floating platform nest. So just kind of, it's what's pictured here on this slide. So kind of these different sticks and different things all kind of built together, and it floats on top of the water. And that helps protect the nest from predators that may be living on land. They're also going to need space. And through some studies, they found that the nests of American coots are about 177 feet apart. So at least while these birds are nesting, they're going to need at least that kind of range for their nest. Now, during the winter, these birds do tend to hang out in large groups. So they'll need a little bit less space per bird, but they may need a large space for all of them to occupy at once. So with these different habitat essentials in mind, what do you think is the ideal habitat for the American coot? Or which one of these three habitats do you think they're most likely to be found in? So think about that for a second. All right, if you said wetlands, you are on the right track. So this is kind of a little bit about what the habitat might look like, where you might find them. So they inhabit a wide variety of freshwater wetlands, from like little ponds to swamps, marshes, to suburban park ponds, and the edges of large lakes. So they have like the bodies of water that they inhabit typically have some heavy strands of vegetation along at least some portion of the shoreline, and at least some depth of standing water within those stands of vegetation. So they really like this vegetation within the water. And so wetlands is where you might find that American coot, because they have those aquatic plants, they have the shelter they need, and they have the nesting material that those coots need. Now, a little bit different and a little bit more generalized is the eastern bluebird. So this is the state bird of Missouri. So let's talk about this species and what they might need. So through studies, they found that eastern bluebirds their nests or their territories are usually less than 650 feet away from water. So they're never farther than 650 feet from water. Now that's still quite a bit of space to occupy, but that's just something to keep in mind. They don't need to be living on the water, but they want to live near water for a water source. Their main food are insects, and that is their main food for much of the year. So they'll forage either by flooding to the ground to grab an insect, or occasionally catching an insect in midair. So you can think about aerial insects and about ground insects. So their major prey include caterpillars, beetles, crickets, grasshoppers, and spiders. And in the wintertime, they'll eat like large amounts of fruit and different things like that. But for the most part, I want you to think about insects in terms of their habitat. So what habitat is going to have a wide variety of those different types of insects that I described? Also shelter. So they're also going to need places to escape from predators, to either ground predators or aerial predators. And the type of nest that they make is a cavity nest. In another week, we talked about woodpeckers and the holes in the cavities that woodpeckers make. So when the woodpeckers are done, sometimes the bluebirds will occupy those nest cavities, but they've also been known to use nest boxes that we put up, which are essentially mimicking what the woodpecker does. So they like to nest in that cavity. And as far as territory size, the amount of space that they need, through studies, they've also found that these birds like to nest 300 feet from another bluebird nesting. So when we're spacing out nest boxes, we typically recommend spacing them 300 feet apart. So what we're looking for in this habitat is cavities, but also insects, a large variety of them, water decently close by, and a pretty large amount of space. So this one's a little bit trickier, but what do you think is the ideal habitat for the eastern bluebird, or where do you think we might find them? All right, this one is a little bit different. So eastern bluebirds, I would describe their habitat as kind of grassland savanna or like forest edge, because they're going to want those kind of that open country. And they're going to want some of those trees either for cavities, or if you put a nest box out, that makes that field a lot more desirable for them as well. But they want little understory sparse ground cover. So they need those like trees around for protection, kind of shelter, but also for those nesting cavities. But they're also going to want that open understory, because that's where we can find like a large variety of insects. Kind of that savanna type habitat. But today you can also find them in pastures, agricultural fields, suburban parks, backyards, golf courses, So they have a little bit more generalist. They're not as specific as the American coot with their habitat, who kind of rely on that like larger body of water. So that's kind of interesting. So you can see kind of how, depending on what you eat, the type of shelter you need, and different things like that, what type of habitat you might want to live in. And also it kind of goes the other way as well, where you might be specially adapted for a certain type of habitat. And so those two things kind of work together to know kind of where we might find some of these different birds. And some of them can be found in all kinds of habitats, and some of them are found in very specific habitats. So the last thing I want to talk about is what we kind of walked through today, with thinking about the essential needs of a species, and then thinking about how the habitat can provide those for them. That's habitat conservation. So that's what conservationists like the Missouri River Bird Observatory and the Missouri Department of Conservation do when they're trying to think about how to protect a species and how to help populations of endangered species. So exactly what we did, they try to figure out the essential needs of a species and how they can help predator provide those things for what a species needs in its habitats. And you can do it at a large scale like these organizations do, or you can do it at a really small scale, and you can do it. Just like in this picture, these two young girls are decorating nest boxes to put up for wrens. So they can use those to provide shelter and nesting spots for those birds. And that's habitat conservation. So you can take part in it too, which is really cool and really important. So that's all I have for Have to Have a Habitat. I hope you learned a little bit more about how birds are intimately tied to their habitats, as they contain the things the birds and all creatures need to survive. And in the future, we're definitely going to talk about more about how everything in a habitat is connected. So the habitat contains what the birds need, and the birds help the habitat thrive. So I hope you learned something, and have a great rest of your day.